Analysis 14 May 2020 The Hindu Local motif on Modi's call for self-reliance syllabus Indian economy and issues relating to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. GS3 Theme PM's call for self-reliance. Context Prime Minister Narendra Modi's emphasis on Tuesday on a renewed drive for a self-reliant India is not merely a reaction to the new global reality spanned by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a throwback to the nationalist economic policies that India and other newly independent nations followed in the last century before the high tide of globalization swept over. His statement also foretells a potential renewal of the Swadeshi economic policies that continued to inspire Hindutva politics long after centrist nationalists have abandoned them. India opened itself to the global market in 1991 through its liberalization, privatization, and globalization policies, but remained cautious as it skirted around the whirlwind of international capital in the following decades. This hesitant approach of India often led to a clamor from various vocal quarters for faster and deeper opening of its economy, but its relative insularity from disruptive global headwinds turned out to be helpful several times in the last 3 decades. When Mr. Modi took over as Prime Minister, there was a renewed cry from global corporations and foreign governments for bolder reforms. If anything, he traveled the opposite course, raising fresh trade barriers and seeking to strengthen India's manufacturing base through the Make in India initiative. In doing so, he has been true to his ideological calling and also to his mandates of 2014 and 2019, which were not sought or won for expanding globalization. Mr. Modi's politics, in fact, rides on the mobilization of people dispossessed and alienated by the numbing match of globalization by providing them new targets to vent their anger on. The pandemic brought to the fore at once the limits and inevitability of globalization. Countries such as the US that relied on others for the supply of essential medicines and medical equipment were suddenly vulnerable. China's unmatched leverage in global supply chains and concerns that it may weaponize trade have prompted a renewed global discussion on the components of national security and how to protect them. At the same time, this pandemic continues to illustrate how inseparably shared is the future of humanity across national boundaries. Mr. Modi understands these dynamics of global politics and has sought to advance India's interests within an emerging framework. He did not repudiate globalization but proposed a new syntax for it, a human centric one, as opposed to the current profit motivated model. According to him, he placed India at its center. This is largely rhetorical and might be unmindful of India's limitations, to the extent that such politics brings succor to the disadvantaged. It is to be welcomed. If this is only a facade for majoritarianism or authoritarianism, it will bring more harm to the same people that this approach professes to protect. His supporters and opponents alike would be eager to see how this philosophy translates into policy. Liquidity lifeline on Nirmala's MSME's package. Syllabus Government policies and interventions for development in various sectors and issues arising out of their design and implementation. GS2 Theme Nirmala's MSME package. Context From an overall perspective, the first tranche of announcements made by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman under the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan on Wednesday is impressive indeed. There are and will be many issues in the details, but taken as a whole, the measures announced will go a long way in lifting the spirits of the two key and troubled sectors of MSMEs and non-banking finance companies. While for the former it is an existential crisis, for the latter it is one of liquidity. The massive rupees 3 lakh crore collateral free assistance handed out to MSMEs but help them crank up their operations. Ms. Siddharaman has done well in extending a sovereign credit guarantee for the complete amount as banks may otherwise have been reluctant to support troubled borrowers. The government could have specified the interest cap on these loans without leaving it to individual lenders as each of them has its own rate structure. Again, the scheme could have been extended until the end of this financial year instead of until October 31. India is now entering the monsoon season when activity is traditionally dull, so it is not clear how many borrowers will get the benefit. The rupees 20,000 crore partially guaranteed subordinated debt program and the rupees 50,000 crore fund of fund scheme will help boost the equity portion of MSME finances, but again the finer details need to be clear. NBFCs, housing finance firms and microfinance entities get a much required liquidity boost in the form of a rupees 30,000 crore scheme wherein their debt paper will be fully guaranteed by the government. With this and the partial credit guarantee scheme of rupees 45,000 crore, the government has broken the logjam wherein banks were unwilling to extend credit deposit the RBI's strong push. This should largely attenuate the liquidity crisis in the non-banking space for now. The minister has also done well in addressing the liquidity issues of power distribution companies through a rupees 90,000 crore infusion that will be securitized on their receivables and backed by a state government guarantee. Wednesday's announcements are focused on the liquidity part of the crisis. While the headline numbers appear big, the reality is that the government will be called upon to bear the liability only if the economic situation becomes hopeless. It may not come to that. What the announcements do is to break the confidence logjam if the credit market and give the assurance to lenders and borrowers that the government is willing to backstop their commitments. This is the signal that MSMEs and their lenders needed as liquidity was always there but only for the most credit worthy of borrowers. Here the government has played its role to perfection. Provide income support, restore jobs, syllabus, government policies and interventions for development in various sectors and issues arising out of their design and implementation. GS2 theme, scrapping of current labor laws. Context. On the contrary, scrapping labor laws will only reduce wages, lower earnings and reduce consumer demand. Shock point, rationalize labor laws. Following the adage never waste a crisis, the government of Uttar Pradesh last week introduced an ordinance that has scrapped most labor laws for 3 years, ostensibly the creating jobs and for attracting factories exciting China following the outbreak of the novel coronavirus. These laws deal with the occupational safety, health and working conditions of workers, regulation of hours of work, wages and settlement of industrial disputes. They apply mostly to the economies recognized formal sector, that is registered factories and companies and large establishments in general. Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat have quickly followed suit. Reportedly, Punjab has already followed 12-hour shifts per day, 72 hours per week in factories without overtime payment to overcome worker shortage after the migrants have left in the wake of the national lockdown. Shock point: snatching away labor rights in the midst of a global pandemic and national lockdown is distressing and shocking. Over the course of the last 7 weeks, we have witnessed unheard of human distress as lakhs of migrant workers continue to desperately trudge to their villages after losing their homes, livelihood, and toehold in cities. Despite overflowing food grain stocks, governments have been miserly in providing adequate food security, income support to workers to retain them in their places of work has also been lacking. Significantly, migrant labor will be critical to restore production once the lockdown is lifted. In fact, factories and shops are already staring at worker shortages. Instead of encouraging workers to stay back or return to cities by ensuring livelihood support and safety nets, state governments have sought to strip workers of their fundamental rights. Employees associations have urged the central government to do away with most labor rights to address temporary labor shortages. Trade union leaders from the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh to the Center of Indian Trade Unions and opposition leaders in Uttar Pradesh have condemned the ordinance. It will face a challenge in courts, legal experts say. The abrogation of labor laws are raising many constitutional and political questions. But will it expand employment and output growth as claimed by its opponents? Such as a step by popular belief will reduce wage costs, increase profits, and augment productive investment and growth. Improved supply is expected to create demand, following Say's law in economics. Such simplistic reasoning assumes that labor laws are the binding constraints on expanding output. Surely the lockdown has disrupted supply, but only temporarily. There are no inherent shortages at the moment as the inflation rate remains moderate. Agricultural produce is rotting in farms for lack of transport. Industrial production is held up as migrant workers have fled for their lives. Before the lockdown, annual GDP growth rate had plummeted to 4.7% during October-December quarter of 2019-20 from 8.3% in the full year of 2016-17. The slowdown is due to lack of demand, not of supply, as widely suggested. With massive job and income losses after the lockdown, aggregate demand has totally slumped with practically no growth. Therefore, the way to restart the economy is to provide income support and restore jobs. This will not only address the humanitarian crisis but also help revive consumer demand by augmenting incomes. Scrapping labor laws to save on labor costs will do just the opposite. It will reduce wages, lower earnings, particularly of low wage workers, and reduce consumer demand. Further, it will lead to an increase of low paid work that offers no security of tenure or income stability. The rationale for scrapping labor laws to attract investment and boost manufacturing growth poses two additional questions. One, if the laws were in fact so strongly pro-worker, they would have raised wages and reduced business profitability. But the real wage growth, net of inflation of directly employed workers in the factory sector, has been flat 2001 to 2015-16, as firms have increasingly resorted to casualization and informalization of the workforce to suppress workers' bargaining power, evidence suggests. 2. Is it right to blame the disappointing industrial performance mainly on labor market regulations? Industrial performance is not just a function of the labor laws but of the size of the market, fixed investment growth, credit availability, infrastructure, and government policies. In fact, there is little evidence to suggest that amendment of key labor laws by Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh in 2014 took them any closer to their goal of creating more jobs or industrial growth. The role of labor market regulations may be more modest than the strong views expressed against them in the popular debates. Rationalize labor laws. Surely India's complex web of labor laws with around 47 central laws and 200 state laws need rationalization. However, now more than ever before, reforms need to maintain a delicate balance between the need for firms to adapt to over-changing market conditions and workers' employment security, depriving workers of fundamental rights such as freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, and a set of primary working conditions such as adequate living wages, limits on hours of work, and safe and healthy workplaces will create a fertile ground for the exploitation of the working class. Presently, over 90% of India's workforce is in informal jobs with no regulations for decent conditions of work, no provisions for social security, and no protection against any contingencies and arbitrary actions of employers. Abrogation of labor laws, as proposed by the Uttar Pradesh government, will free more employers from the obligations they currently hold for ensuring the job security, health, and social protection of their workers. It will increase informal employment in the formal sector instead of encouraging the growth of formal work. As India battles the economic and social consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, many state governments have seized the opportunities to scrap labor laws on the pretext of encouraging employment. Such a decision makes little economic sense currently, as it will reduce share of wages in output, thereby reducing growth in domestic demand and hurting output expansion. Significantly, exports cannot be an option for now, as the global economy is staring at the possibility worse than the Great Depression. Hence, the Uttar Pradesh government's move will only result in a race to the bottom of workers' pay and labor standards, making workers worse off without creating additional jobs, as it is a lack of demand that is currently holding up output growth. The Uttar Pradesh ordinance need to be revoked, lock, stock, and barrel. The death of fatalism. Syllabus. Salient features of Indian society, diversity of India. GS1. Theme. Humanity must have a realistic view of what is given and the extent to which it can be altered. Context. The near absence of fatalism. Human powers versus chance. The pandemic is an epoch-changing moment. Millions have fallen sick. Hundreds of thousands have succumbed and to the disease. We have been caught unawares and still do not know how to deal with it. Historic events such as this compel us to raise big questions, usually submerged in the hustle and bustle of life. What is and what isn't in human control? How to make sense of collective helplessness in the face of abrupt changes? What is the place of contingency, fortune, and misfortune in our life? Fatalism provides one answer. Human agency is insignificant. We are permanent victims of indestructible forces beyond our control. With the arrival of the pandemic, the surge of fatalism seems inevitable within popular consciousness. What else can we expect in the land of karma? The idea that birth, status, marriage, occupation, all life experiences, and death are predetermined is in our personal destiny inscribed on our forehead or in the lines of our palm. Are we not already allotted a share, bhaga, of fortune or misfortune at birth? Isn't Hinduism virtually synonymous with fatalism? Surely we must then expect a lot of fatalistic gloom in this time. The near absence of fatalism, yet there is scarce evidence for it. I don't see ordinary people resign to their fate, an inscrutable, unpredictable force that acts on humans against their will, mocks their agency, and humiliates them. Instead, they expect governments to take charge, doctors and nurses to save life, scientists to deliver a cure, fellow citizens to behave responsibly. The poor do not seem to abjectly surrender to their fate either. They are willing to take huge risks and return home, not die of hunger when abandoned by governments. In short, Hindu fatalism seems to be a myth spun by Western Orientalistic imagination, or perhaps sustained by the rich who imagine the poor to be victims of fate. It is not what the poor believe about themselves. This near absence of fatalism in India is not a gift of modernity. Historically, large segments of Indian thought are non-fatalistic and give an important place to human agency. The philosopher Sukumari Bhattacharya made a plausible case for the absence of fatalism in various ancient texts: the Rigveda, the Brahmanas, the Samhitas, the Upanishads, the Aranyakas, and in Jaimini's Purva Mimamsa. The theory of karma found in the teachings of Buddha and Mahavira are not just atheistic but valorize human agency. Though the idea of fate exists, it is immanent, inscribed, and dependent upon human actions spread over many births. Likewise, in Puranic literature, fate and human agency coexist. In Mahabharata, there are two kinds of rishis. The Pravriti sects engaged in the world draw upon the power of tabas, religious austerity, to dominate their surroundings. The Nirvadi Sikhs renunciate, actively acquire spiritual knowledge by which to escape their surroundings. Both reject the argument that humans are victims of forces beyond their control. In ancient India, perhaps only the atheistic Ajaivikas embraced the fatalism. In Indian folk literature, one frequently finds a god or goddess coming to write the bhagya, share of fortune or fate, on the forehead of the newborn. Several Indian languages have a term for it. Thalelittu and Thaleviti in Tamil, Haneli Barebidu and Hane Bareha in Kannada, Fala Likita in Sanskrit. In Hindustani too, phrases such as Hamari Kismat Mein Ye Likhta Hai are common. This is often taken as an affirmation of Indian fatalism, but then the same literature invites us to use one's wit to overturn or at least modify Bhagya writ on our forehead. Fate can be thwarted by action, particularly by those prepared to take risks. It can also be challenged, especially among the unprivileged, by witchcraft or worship of ancestors and local deities. Anthropologists like Kathleen Goff recorded the derision which Dalits in Tamil Nadu dismiss idea of Bhagya, Falaligita or inexorable fate. For upper classes, castes, astrology appears to perform the same function, for it suggests appropriate strategies to manage Bhagya, fortune, or avert Durbhagya, misfortune, not surrender to it. In conditions of extreme, prolonged distress, entire worldviews may emerge that make human vulnerability permanent, unexpected, unpredictable forces salient, and render human agency, order, and reason insignificant. Consider the idea of the absurd which emerged during the Second World War, underscoring the futility of the search for meaning, quite like fatalism that stress the futility of human action. But extreme action negating worldviews like fatalism must not be conflated with perspectives that give importance to fate. Fate is an integral, recurrent feature of the human condition. In every civilization, such concepts emerge unbidden. All ancient world views had a term for it: Moira in Greek, Ming in Chinese, and Bhagya in Sanskrit. Modern world views too must incorporate fate. Why? The human world can always be viewed as a great contest between human agency and nature, something currently beyond control. The more humans are able to control their destiny, the less room in their perspective they have for fate. The more the world is comprehended, the less inscrutable it is. But there are times when most human beings feel utterly helpless, say in times of war, natural calamities, social upheavals, or personal misfortune. In such moments of extreme vulnerability and loss of control, when things seem beyond rational comprehension, ordinary human beings with their practical consciousness rely on notions such as fate. They submit, surrender, resign themselves to, and eventually accept their condition. So be it, such is my lot. Human powers versus chance. In short, an ongoing battle rages between what the Italian humanist Machiavelli calls virtue, human powers, and fortuna, chance or fate. We need to constantly experience and evaluate which way the balance will tilt. Individuals, socialists, and indeed humanity must have a realistic view of what is given and the extent to which it can be altered. It is impossible to entirely give up a conception of something beyond us and equally to entirely reject a modicum of responsibility for one's actions. We are always in part responsible for what is happening to us, though this contracts our enlarge depending on circumstances. However, one element that perpetually evades control is sheer fortuitousness in our life. Accidents, coincidence, disease, disasters, sudden bereavements, all of which defy human agency and thwart the best of plans. They compel us to rely solely on the idea of fate. Indeed, more than good luck, fate is linked to misfortune and death. No wonder accidents that result in death are called fatal, and human beings who perish in disasters are called fatalities. In some, while fatalism, whose over-valorization of fate nullifies human agency, must disappear. Views that introduce the dialectic of fate and human agency to account for contingency, misfortune, and bad luck cannot be erased. However, even their relevance or efficacy can be reduced by better understanding, sounder explanations, with the wisdom to know what can and cannot be controlled, indeed, by properly evaluating what should or should not be controlled.